we have some problems with the public education system, and I think there's some real concerns if you're an educator about the working conditions that you're experiencing, because those working conditions are the students' learning conditions.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So, Adam, you worked for the Alabama Education Association for a while. You were also a public school teacher here in Alabama for a few years, and so you still have family who are in the education system. So you really follow the education politics in the state pretty closely, probably more closely than anybody else that I know. And one of the things that the AEA does after a legislative session, is my understanding, is that they release a report, or they include a report in their regular communication with the members, and so that just came out last week. Is that right?
Sure, yeah. They just sent out their June 2024 edition of the Alabama School Journal. That's like the AEA newspaper. That's their communications to the membership, and also goes out, more broadly. Obviously, other folks see that as well. So it's a somewhat public-facing communication medium. And, after the legislative session, they always, of course, naturally, report on what happened in the legislative session. So was very interested in this headline I saw.
Yeah, well, just to set it up for you, this was a very consequential session for teachers in that, quote-unquote, school choice, the voucher program, privatization scheme, diverting $100 million from the public education system into the private education system, where, the vast majority of families in the private education system are already wealthy, much more wealthy than the average Alabamian. It's going to be going to a lot of religious schools who are going to be teaching things that, are religious in nature, not everybody agrees with. Public money is going to be going to subsidize that, hugely. Probably, one of the probably the most consequential piece of education legislation detrimentally for Alabama's teachers and the public education system since the taking over of the legislature by the Republicans in 2010, right?
Well, it's certainly up there. It's the most significant one, I would say, in several years, right? Because right after the Republicans took over in 2010, they went to war on public schools and on AEA specifically, right? There was like a political grudge to, carry out there. And so there was like a wave of anti-public school laws that took place from 2011 up through, 2014, 2015, somewhere in that area. That's when you saw the legalization of charter schools. It's when you saw the establishment of the Accountability Act, which did two things. It set up a private school scholarship program, which is basically a form of vouchers. It also set up the quote-unquote failing schools list, where the bottom performing schools in the state were labeled failing schools. And, of course, it was made easier to transfer out of those schools. Funny enough, it didn't provide extra resources for the failing schools. I guess that helps. I don't know. When I was a teacher, some kids would not do so great on their test and their academic work. And there was an expectation that I couldn't just say, well, they're failing students. There was an expectation that I had to communicate with the parents, that I had to take some extra steps and jump through some extra hoops to make sure I had done my job as an educator and given that child every possible opportunity. So that, I can't help but note the irony there of simply just labeling schools failing. So you had this rash of laws passed right after the Republican takeover. But this is the most significant one since then, for sure. As you mentioned, $100 million. That's just the upfront costs. It will grow from there every year. And it's not mentioned in this article, by the way.
Not even mentioned. That's wild.
The headline is AEA finishes another successful session for educators. So... Educators, reach out to us. Let us know, how successful was the legislative session? Do you feel really good about it? Are you tired of winning yet? Are you tired of it? Because from what I'm reading, whole lot of winning going on. No mention of the Choose Act. That's curious. It's the biggest expansion of school choice in nearly a decade. It's not mentioned in the legislative recap here. Maybe it's because AEA testified as neutral on that piece of legislation. That's very curious. Why would you do that? Isn't that against everything you stand for? I don't know. That's just kind of weird to me. Folks may want to ask questions about that. I have questions about that, but so there's no mention of that. There is quite a bit of mention of the Alabama Teacher Bill of Rights, which grants teachers more authority when dealing with the challenges of student discipline. And I will say that this is an issue that does resonate deeply with educators. It's something that I received many, many phone calls about as an advocate. It's a real issue, but I can't help but be a little skeptical because you know what else is in the state law? A lot of things. A lot of things that apply to schools. How are they enforced? Oh, they're not. Because turns out when you don't have a collective bargaining agreement, we don't have a union that can fight to uphold and enforce a collective bargaining agreement. How do you hold people accountable, right? There are already laws in place regarding school safety and student acts of aggression that aren't being followed. They're not being properly recorded and reported. There's state laws around minimum planning time that teachers are supposed to get. They're supposed to get 30 minutes free of supervision and instruction per day. But what happens when you don't get that? You just deal with it, right? Because that's the way it's set up in Alabama.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
So yeah, if you think that's really great, if things are going well, if it's very successful, I'm sure, you know, you're not alone, obviously, in that assessment. But frankly, I think we have some problems with the public education system. And I think there's some real concerns if you're an educator about the working conditions that you're experiencing, because those working conditions are the students' learning conditions. You just mentioned earlier in the show that only 40% of 4-year-olds in the state have access to pre-K, right? We're talking about a successful session for education, and less than half of our 4-year-olds qualify for pre-K. And we actually have a pretty good pre-K program in this state.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's like, hasn't it been in the past like the #1 preschool program in the country?
Highly evaluated, very highly evaluated. And so, you know, there's just so many issues when we look at the public education system and the lack of rights that educators have. And that's why I'm so passionate about the need for labor law reform and why public sector workers deserve the same union rights that private sector workers have, or that workers in the public sector have in other states. If you're an Alabama teacher, do you think you deserve less rights than a teacher in California or New York? I mean, think about it. Do you think you're less than them? Because they have contracts, and the difference between, you know, the 1 page that you may sign when you get hired and the 50 pages in their contract is 50 pages of things that protect the employee.
Right.
That can be enforced, that you can grieve, that you can take to your union. So it's a big difference. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting headline that I wanted to share with you because seems a little at odds with what most people would think about how public schools shook out in this legislative session, but you know, I'm not them. So there we go.
Well, you know, so Adam, the one thing that they do mention and that they seem really proud of is the Teachers Bill of Rights, and you know, they also mentioned the 2% raise, which is something like a 1% pay cut when you account for inflation just for this year. And my understanding is that throughout the pandemic, Alabama's the state of Alabama has never actually kept up with inflation over these past 4 years in the raises that they gave their teachers, right? Isn't that right?
Yeah, my understanding is it has not kept up with inflation, and you know, there were studies even before this recent wave of inflation coming out of the pandemic. There were a lot of studies showing that teacher salaries never even caught up after the Great Recession. Because of years of frozen salaries and, you know, very, very modest below inflation increases.
Right.
Right.
And so the Teachers' Bill of Rights thing, the primary thing there is about the discipline with the students. And you know, I'm not in the education world in the same way that you are, but when I talk to people who are in the education world, the student discipline actually does come up, honestly, even more or at least as much as pay. And pay is a huge issue, but student discipline has been something that I have heard a lot about, as far as like it's difficult for teachers to work because the students are difficult to discipline. And you know, I'm very my intuition is to be very skeptical of more kind of punitive measures, particularly involving like police in schools, and I'm very concerned that even though this is ostensibly aimed and maybe even with, you know, fine motives, not, you know, maybe not even malicious motives, but I'm concerned that this is going to further increase the kind of
The disparities?
The disparities and the criminalization of children's bad behavior. That, you know, I mean, when my parents and you know, people my parents' age were in school, like, people got in fights and people, you know, kids like hurt each other, right? You know what I mean? Like, people would bloody each other or whatever. And,
right.
and it was a fight, and it was a discipline issue. It was an issue for the parents. You know, the police were never involved. But even as, you know, I mean, I graduated high school almost 10 years ago, but I even remember people being arrested at school for fighting. And it's like, that's just doesn't, you know, it's very concerning to me, you know, that kind of language. And so does this Bill of Rights, have you been able to read it and to see if you feel like this is going to be, you know, positive for the teachers and importantly, the students, you know?
I'm not going to comment on it just yet because I really need the time to analyze it, because I have some of the same hesitations that you do. And I've always struggled with this in education because, on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to teachers' concerns about student discipline. Having been in a classroom with, you know, over 30 ninth graders at one time, it can be tough. It can be really tough. And the lack of administrative support is a real issue. The lack of parental support often is an issue. I am very concerned, though, about, increasing punitive measures in a way that doesn't actually solve issues or doesn't help the students in ways that could increase racial disparities, right? Because that is a real problem that we have to acknowledge, particularly here in Alabama, that schools and the way they punish students has not always been equitable. And black students have been punished more severely for the same offenses as white students, and that sort of thing still happens. And so I am a little hesitant on it, and I've always been torn on these issues because of that very reason, right? I'm anti-authoritarian by my nature, and so it's a really tricky one. So yeah, I'm looking forward to really reading through this and seeing what I see and what may, you know, come out of it. I think it's, regardless of whether it's good or bad, we can recognize the intent is supposedly to help teachers be more effective in the classroom. And I think my point still stands that without a union collective bargaining agreement, these things are just written on paper and are enforced unevenly at best. So yeah, I have those same concerns, and I think that's a real valid issue, that the increasing criminalization of student behavior. And it's tough because you talk to some teachers and like they want more cops in schools. They want more security in schools, right? And so that's where these issues can get really tricky, because yes, the teacher's working conditions are the student's learning conditions, but they're coming from different angles. And if you're not careful, you can take approaches that silo off, right? Those different groups that really do have a shared interest ultimately. And so, yeah, that's something to be aware of, and something for us to dive deeper into in the future for sure.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.